This is the Disturbing Islam Iceberg. Tier 1. The Prophet Wife. Around 623 CE in Medina, the Islamic prophet Muhammad officially started living as husband and wife with Aisha, the daughter of Abu Bakr, one of his closest friends and companions. For more than 1,000 years, mainstream Islamic scholars agreed that the marriage contract was signed when Aisha was 6 years old, and that the marriage was made official when she was 9. At the time, Muhammad was around 53. Now, getting promised to someone young wasn't all that unusual in 7th century Arabia. The bedroom part with a 9-year-old, though, that was considered extreme even back then. And there's no record of any other major Abrahamic prophet doing anything close to it. So the story has always been a problem. But for most of the last 1,300 years, nobody really sat down to check whether the timeline actually held up. When modern researchers finally did, the math fell apart pretty quickly. The age 9 claim runs into 3 separate timeline issues, and 2 of them come from things Aisha herself reportedly said about her own life. The first timeline issue is her older half-sister, Asma. Historical records put Asma at exactly 100 years old when she died, which was 73 years after the Muslim migration to Medina. Do the math backwards and Asma was 27 at the migration. Other records say she was 10 years older than Aisha, which puts Aisha at 17 during the migration, and around 18 or 19 by the time she joined the Prophet in the bedroom a year or 2 later, not 9. The second one is a chapter of the Quran called Surah al-Qamar, revealed sometime around 615 CE, about 8 years before the marriage. Aisha clearly remembered being a young girl playing outside when it came down. If she really was 9 when she joined the Prophet, she would have been 1 year old when al-Qamar dropped. And toddlers don't sit around forming detailed memories of anything. If she was 19, she'd have been around 11 at the revelation, which actually checks out. The third one is the Battle of Uhud, 3 years after the migration. The Prophet had a strict rule that anyone under 15 wasn't allowed near a battlefield. By the official story, Aisha would have been 11 at the Uhud, which is way too young by the Prophet's own rules. And yet, Islamic sources put her at the battle, hauling water to wounded soldiers. At the older age, she'd have been around 20, which is exactly the kind of person you'd actually send to do that. So, if the timeline was broken in 3 different places, where did the age of 9 even come from? Oxford historian Joshua Little traces it back to one man, Aisha's great-nephew Hisham ibn Urwa, who claimed he heard the story from his dad, who supposedly heard it straight from Aisha. The problem is that the earliest Islamic records from Medina barely mention any of this. The hadith only really starts going around after Hisham packs up and moves to Kufa in Iraq, sometime in the mid-700s, into a city full of people who openly hated Aisha because of her role leading an army against their leader, Ali ibn Abi Talib. Little's argument is that Hisham made up the young age to paint his great-aunt as innocent and pure, with zero romantic history before the Prophet. If that's what really happened, it was supposed to be a quick cleanup job. Hisham just didn't know how badly his claims would age over the next 1,300 years. Nation of Islam. In July of 1930, on the streets of Detroit, Michigan, a traveling salesman named Wallace Fard Muhammad was going door to door through black neighborhoods that were being crushed by poverty and racist laws. Officially, he was selling silk, perfume, and drugs. Unofficially, he was spreading one of the wildest humanity origin stories ever pitched to anyone. He told people he was the Great Mahdi, a savior figure from Islamic tradition sent to set the world straight. And folks were completely hooked. His followers quickly grew into a brand new religious group that came to be known as the Nation of Islam. The core message was that Islam was the original religion of black people, stolen from them during slavery, and that black people were the original man, who had ruled the earth for trillions of years before everything went sideways. The lore started about 6,600 years ago, when a boy named Yaqub was born just outside the holy city of Mecca. He was kinda like a black megamind, with an enormous head and genius-level intelligence. By the age of 6, Yaqub had already figured out that the original black man secretly carried 2 traits, a dark one and a lighter one, and that if you bred out the dark one over enough generations, you could engineer a brand new race from scratch. He started preaching this and racked up around 60,000 followers, which freaked the authorities in Mecca out enough to exile his entire crew to an island called Patmos. Out there, with nothing but time and a captive audience, Yaqub decided to actually pull the trigger on his breeding plan just despite the people who'd kicked him out. His goal was to create a brand new race, bleached of color and stripped of goodness, basically a wicked mirror version of his own rebellion. The breeding program ran for 600 years, and the rules were brutal. Dark-skinned babies were killed off, while the lighter-skinned ones got to live and reproduce. Generation by generation, the population kept getting paler, until a fully white, blue-eyed race finally spawned into existence. According to the Nation of Islam theology, this new race had been bred without the divine nature of the original black man, which left them naturally pulled toward deception and violence. To put it simply, they came out as literal devils. Allah then let these devils run the world for 6,000 years as a kind of test. During that stretch, they spread across Europe, toppled civilizations through lies and manipulation, and eventually enslaved black people in America using a strategy NOI leaders called tricknology, which is honestly one of the most cartoonish supervillain sounding words ever invented. For 4 years, Wallace Fard Muhammad used this lore to build his following. But right as the movement was picking up serious traction, Fard vanished into thin air in 1934, leaving behind zero clues and a highly paranoid group of believers. His top student, Elijah Muhammad, moved fast. He told everyone Fard had actually been Allah walking around in human form the whole time, and that he had simply gone back to heaven and left him in charge. With his fresh divine credentials in hand, Elijah cranked the lore up even further. He preached that white rule was almost up, and that when the end arrived, righteous black people would be saved by a gigantic spaceship called the Mother Plane, also known as the Mother Wheel. On the Day of Judgment, the Mother Plane will launch smaller crafts loaded with bombs. The bombs will go off and the blast will set the planet on fire and keep the surface burning for hundreds of years, while the righteous believers float safely up above. Once the fires finally burn out, they'll come back down to inherit a cleansed paradise, free of evil forever. The Asia Bibi case. In June 2009, inside a small farming village in Pakistan's Punjab province, a poor Christian farm worker named Asia Bibi, also known as Asiya Noreen, was picking berries alongside a group of Muslim women under brutal summer heat. As you can imagine, they were all exhausted, dehydrated, and cranky. Eventually, Asia became desperately thirsty, so she walked over to a nearby well and drank from a shared metal cup. Suddenly, the other women started yelling at her. They claimed that because she was Christian, touching the cup had made the water religiously impure. The argument dragged on for a while before everyone eventually went back to work. It was supposed to be one of those workplace fights people forget about before dinner, but instead, it somehow escalated into a death sentence. Rumors about the argument spread through the village until they reached a local religious leader who hadn't even been at the farm during the fight. He filed a police complaint accusing Asia of insulting the Prophet Muhammad during the argument. Asia denied the whole thing and said her coworkers had cooked the story up between them. But by that point, the situation was already out of her hands. Angry crowds gathered, calling for her arrest. The police picked her up shortly after, and she was charged under Section 295C of Pakistan's Penal Code, the country's blasphemy law. Under that law, the crime of insulting Islam can get you the death penalty. So needless to say, the stakes were about as high as they could get. Even though the evidence and witness statements were about as solid as a Reddit conspiracy thread, the court treated the accusations as fact and sentenced Asia Bibi to death by hanging in 2010. The case exploded across Pakistan almost overnight, and two major politicians stuck their necks out to publicly defend Asia. The first was Salman, the governor of Punjab province, who pointed out that the blasphemy laws were being used to settle personal grudges. The second was Shahbaz Bhatti, the only Christian member of Pakistan's cabinet, who pushed for actual reform. What they were saying was pretty reasonable, but reason goes out the window the moment you remember where and when this was happening. To Pakistan's religious extremists, questioning the blasphemy laws basically counted as committing blasphemy yourself. In January 2011, Taseer was walking through a market in Islamabad when one of his own bodyguards, a guy named Mumtaz Qadri, pulled out an assault rifle and shot him repeatedly in the back. 2 months later, Shahbaz Bhatti got ambushed and murdered by militants while driving through the capital. Somehow, the story still managed to get darker from there. When Qadri, the bodyguard who killed his boss, showed up in court, people showered him with rose petals and lawyers publicly praised him for defending Islam. Even after the government finally executed him years later, his followers built a massive shrine over his grave and started treating it like a pilgrimage site for a holy warrior. Meanwhile, Asia Bibi spent nearly a decade isolated inside a tiny prison cell on death row while the country argued over whether she deserved to stay alive. Finally, in 2018, Pakistan's Supreme Court reviewed the evidence and realized the witness testimonies were filled with contradictions and outright lies. The court overturned the conviction and declared Asia innocent. That decision triggered nationwide chaos. A radical Islamist political party called Tehreek-e-Labak Pakistan, or TLP, launched massive protests across the country. Protesters blocked highways, shut down major cities, and openly demanded Asia's execution. At that point, the Pakistani government openly admitted they could no longer guarantee her safety in public. So, Asia spent months moving between secret safe houses before finally escaping the country and receiving asylum in Canada. Charlie Hebdo attacks. Imagine you work for a small magazine in Paris. It's an ordinary morning. Everyone's half asleep, laughing, throwing around ideas for the next issue. Then out of nowhere, gunshots go off downstairs. Before anyone can even process what's happening, two armed men walk in with assault rifles and point them straight at you. That's what happened to the Charlie Hebdo office on January 7th, 2015. Charlie Hebdo is a French satirical magazine known for mocking pretty much everyone with a pulse. Over the years, they've gone after Catholic leaders, French presidents, far-right politicians, and any public figure unlucky enough to land in a scandal. In France, the general attitude is that nothing is off-limits for satire, and Charlie Hebdo took full advantage of that. Unfortunately, that's also exactly what pushed them into the one decision that turned the usual steady stream of angry comments they regularly received into actual death threats. Back in 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published a set of controversial cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. Visual depictions of the Prophet are forbidden in Islam, and a lot of Muslims worldwide saw the cartoons as a serious insult. The drawings ended up sparking massive protests and violent unrest across several countries. A few months later, Charlie Hebdo decided to republish the exact same cartoons in France as a statement defending free speech. The magazine's editor, Stéphane Charbonnier, better known as Charb, doubled down on the decision publicly and refused to apologize for any of it. The backlash escalated from angry protests to groups like al-Qaeda deciding the people involved deserved to die. They even published a wanted dead or alive notice with Charb's name on it. The threats got serious enough that French authorities assigned him a full-time police bodyguard. But even while living under constant protection, Charb refused to stop publishing controversial material. While all of this was happening, two French-born brothers, named Sherif and Said Kouachi, were paying very close attention. The brothers had spent years adopting extremist beliefs, and one of them had reportedly traveled to Yemen to train with al-Qaeda. French intelligence agencies knew they were dangerous, but by 2014, European counter-terrorism units were getting flooded with new investigations as more extremists traveled overseas to join militant groups. Eventually, they stopped actively watching the Kouachi brothers, believing they no longer posed an immediate threat. As you'll see from what happened next, that couldn't have been farther from the truth. On the morning of January 7, 2015, the brothers decided to pay a visit to Charlie Hebdo's Paris headquarters armed with assault rifles. They started by shooting a maintenance worker in the lobby. Then they forced cartoonist Corinne Ray to enter the security code so they could reach the editorial floor upstairs. Charb, his bodyguard, and the rest of the editorial staff were all gathered in the meeting room when the brothers walked in and opened fire. Within minutes, 12 people were dead, including Charb himself. The massacre kicked off one of the largest manhunts in modern French history. The country went into full panic mode. Schools locked down, streets emptied, and heavily armed police flooded every major area searching for the attackers. 2 days later, French tactical units cornered the brothers inside a printing warehouse north of Paris. After a tense standoff, officers stormed the building, killed both men, and brought the manhunt to a close. Farkhunda Malikzada. It's March 19, 2015, and a man is standing near a famous blue-tide mosque in Kabul named Shah-e-du Shamshira. Out of nowhere, he starts screaming and pointing at a young woman, telling everyone within earshot that she's an American agent who just burned a Quran. Within minutes, a crowd of men closes in around her. This was the beginning of the end for 27-year-old Farkhunda Malikzada. Now, Farkhunda was about as far from a spy as you could get. She was a deeply religious Afghan woman who was studying Islamic law because she wanted to become a judge someday. Her only mistake, if you can even call it that, was confronting a mosque caretaker named Zainuddin, who'd been selling lucky charms and amulets to desperate people outside the premises, which is considered forbidden in Islamic tradition. When Farkhunda confronted him, Zainuddin didn't take it well. Instead of actually defending himself, he went straight for the worst thing he could possibly say in a place like that, and started yelling that she'd burned a Quran. His lies spread fast, and it was only a matter of minutes before things escalated. As the crowd grew larger, Farkhunda kept trying to defend herself. Witnesses said she screamed that she was Muslim and would never disrespect the Quran, but the bloodthirsty mob ignored her and decided to hand out punishment for her offense. The Afghan National Police were standing right there watching the mob get violent, and they did almost nothing to stop it. A few of them did try at first. They pulled Farkhunda up onto a roof to get her away from the mob, but the second the rioters started throwing stones and she fell back down, they just gave up. Some of them actually stepped aside to let the mob through. Others just stood there directing traffic around the chaos. Every bit of what came next was caught on phone cameras. The mob beat Farkhunda with wooden planks, dropped concrete blocks on her, and one man finished it off by running her over with his car. Then they dragged her body down to the dry bed of the Kabul River and set it on fire. When the flames started dying, men in the crowd actually stripped off their own shirts and tossed them in to keep it burning, all while chanting religious slogans. By the next morning, the footage was all over Afghan social media. People who had defended the mob the day before suddenly started backpedaling, and pressure piled up on the government to actually do something about it. An investigation was opened, and a few days later it was confirmed that Farkhunda was completely innocent, and no Quran had been burned at all, which would have been good news, except for the small issue that she was already dead. When that finding went public, the case took on a life of its own. At her funeral, the women of Kabul broke tradition. Normally, only men carry the coffin, but this time the women refused to let that happen. They carried Farkhunda the entire way themselves, to honor her, and as a final act of protest against the men who had killed her and those who stood by and watched. Despite the video evidence, the legal case didn't lead to much. The government arrested 49 people, including 19 police officers. Initially, the court gave the death penalty to the 4 main leaders, including Zainuddin. However, a year later, a secret appeal knocked those punishments down to prison sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. The 11 police officers who were found guilty of not doing their jobs received only 1-year prison sentences, and their supervisor was left off the hook with no charges at all. Tier 2. The Great Fitna. On a hot day in 632, the Prophet Muhammad died after falling seriously ill in his home in Medina. While his family prepared his body for burial, political leaders gathered at a meeting place called Saqifa to deal with one pressing question: who was going to run the fast-growing Islamic empire now? After a heated debate, his close companion, Abu Bakr, was chosen as the first caliph, or leader of the Muslim community. But there was a problem. Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, wasn't even there. He was busy handling the funeral. Because of that, many of Ali's supporters felt leadership had been taken away from the Prophet's own family, and they felt cheated. At first, Ali just accepted the decision, because the last thing anyone needed was the Muslim community splitting apart. But the tension didn't go anywhere. It was present for decades while the empire kept expanding like nothing was wrong. Then, everything collapsed during the rule of the third caliph, Uthman ibn Affan. Uthman started practicing some major nepotism by giving some of the top, high-paying government positions to his own family members, the Umayyads, and the rest of the empire went mad over this favoritism. In 656 CE, rebels from Egypt stormed his house in Medina and assassinated him. With the capital in chaos and the leader gone, people eventually turned to Ali to restore order. But what he inherited was a ticking time bomb. Uthman's relatives, especially the powerful Syrian governor, Muawiyah, were demanding revenge for the assassination. The problem was that many of the rebels responsible had already joined Ali's side and made up a big part of his support base. So punishing them risked tearing his own coalition apart overnight. It didn't take long for that pressure to boil over. The situation escalated into the First Fitna, the first great Islamic civil war. In 656, Aisha, The Prophet's widow even led an army against Ali at the Battle of the Camel, insisting that failing to punish the killers would destroy the authority of the caliphate. The conflict continued until the final showdown in the Battle of Siffin at 657. Ali's army was close to defeating Muawiyah when Muawiyah's advisors pulled one of the most famous stunts in religious history. Muawiyah told his soldiers to tape pages of the Holy Quran to the tip of their spears and scream for peace. It worked. Ali's soldiers were so religious that they couldn't bring themselves to stab men holding the holy book. Ali was forced into negotiations, but the peace talk backfired on him. By agreeing to talk it out, he ended up looking weak and indecisive to his followers, while Muawiyah looked powerful. At this point, Muawiyah didn't just want justice for his cousin anymore. He was officially gunning for the throne. Some of Ali's own followers were so angry about the compromise that they broke away completely and formed the Khariji. In their heads, everyone involved had betrayed Allah and deserved death, so they formed an underground assassination group. They spent months plotting in the shadows and tracking the leader's every move. About 4 years later, in January 661, one of them, named Abd al-Rahman ibn Muljam, waited inside a mosque in Kufa for Ali to arrive for morning prayers. He blended into the crowd, and the moment Ali bowed down, he rushed forward and struck him with a poisoned sword. Ali later died from the wound. After Ali's death, Muawiyah seized power, moved the capital to Damascus, and transformed the caliphate into a family dynasty. The war was technically over, but the damage never really healed. These Muslim succession conflicts eventually evolved into the two main branches of Islam. The Sunni branch backed the established political leaders, starting with Abu Bakr, while the Shia branch strictly supported Ali's bloodline. It ended up dividing an entire religion for the next 1400 years. The Tragedy of Karbala. On October 10, 680 CE, a massive imperial army surrounded a small family caravan on the burning desert plains of Karbala in Iraq. At the center of it was Hussein, the son of Ali ibn Abi Talib and grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. The soldiers' strategy was to break the group through hunger, thirst, and exhaustion before any real fighting even began. The tragedy was the direct sequel to the Great Fitna. After Ali was assassinated, his rival, Muawiyah I, took control of the Islamic Empire and later passed power to his son, Yazid I. That decision broke the original Islamic tradition of choosing leaders by voting, which naturally made everyone absolutely furious. One of the people who refused to accept Yazid's leadership was Ali's son, Hussein. When Yazid demanded that he publicly swear loyalty to him, Hussein refused because he believed Yazid would destroy the moral foundation of Islam from within. This made him a problem. To avoid trouble, Hussein left for Mecca. While he was there, people in Kufa sent him letters asking him to come and lead a rebellion to overthrow Yazid. They promised support, loyalty, and soldiers. So Hussein believed them and traveled to Iraq with his family, believing an entire rebellion was waiting for him. But by the time he arrived, everything had fallen apart. While Hussein was still on the road, Yazid sent a brutal governor into town who immediately executed the underground leaders of the rebellion, terrified the locals, and effectively put a stop to the whole thing. By the time Hussein reached Iraq, most of his supposed supporters had either logged out, hidden themselves, or suddenly discovered they had other plans. After he learned things weren't going as planned, Hussein tried to turn back. But before he could leave, an Umayyad military patrol intercepted his small family caravan and forced them into the open desert of Karbala. The soldiers also took control of the nearby Euphrates River and blocked Hussein's group from accessing any water. For 3 days, Hussein's camp, which included men, women, and babies, suffered under the desert heat with no water while the soldiers surrounded them. By October 10, they were weak, dehydrated, and barely standing. Then, the massacre started. Hussein's group resisted, but they were gradually overwhelmed. One by one, his companions and family members were killed. Eventually, Hussein himself was the last warrior standing. Exhausted, wounded, and completely surrounded, he kept fighting until the soldiers finally cut him down and beheaded him. With all the men dead, the surviving women and children were chained up and dragged across the desert as prisoners. Meanwhile, Hussein's severed head was reportedly carried from city to city as a political trophy. It was meant to prove that the rebellion had been crushed and that Yazid was firmly in control. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The sheer brutality of killing the Prophet Muhammad's grandson, starving his family, and parading the survivors in chains horrified large parts of the Muslim world. Even neutral crowds were disgusted by what happened at Karbala. So instead of making Hussein look weak, the massacre turned him into a symbol of resistance against corrupt rulers. The Umayyads technically won the battle, but they ended up creating one of the most powerful martyr narratives in human history. The aftermath of Karbala permanently changed Islam. After Hussein's death, his supporters increasingly separated themselves from the larger Muslim community and developed what became Shia Islam. Over 1,300 years later, millions of Shia Muslims still gather every year during Ashura to mourn Hussein's death. Musaylima, the liar. In 630, a large Arabian tribe called the Banu Hanifa sent a delegation to Medina to set up an alliance with the rising new Islamic State. An elderly man named Maslama tagged along. When they got there, he stayed behind at the travelers' camp to watch the camels while the rest of the group went in to meet Muhammad. The meeting went so well that the whole delegation converted to Islam on the spot. And when someone mentioned that a member of the group had stayed behind to watch the animals, Muhammad sent gifts out to him and praised him for being loyal. Still, Maslama wasn't satisfied. He didn't want gifts from the Prophet. He wanted to be him. So he started telling people he was a messenger of God too, claiming the angel Gabriel had visited him, and split the job of prophethood between him and Muhammad. Kind of like walking into Apple after Steve Jobs built it up and announcing you're now an equal partner. To prove his claim, he started writing rhyming verses he called holy revelations, figuring that if a line rhymed, it pretty much had to be from God. The problem was that while the Quran tackled deep theology and the afterlife, Maslama's verses were, well, weird. The Quran famously uses an army of elephants to show God's power. Maslama tried to cover the same subject and came up with something that read like a Wikipedia page written by a toddler. He wrote, "The elephant. What is an elephant? It has a ropey tail and a long trunk." To be fair, he wasn't wrong, but his claims weren't exactly spiritually groundbreaking. Maslama knew the poetry wasn't doing the job, so he made his version of Islam a lot more fun to sign up for. Where the original required strict discipline like praying 5 times a day and giving up alcohol, he told his followers none of that was necessary. That approach won him followers, but it also earned him plenty of enemies. The Muslims in Medina saw his verses as a clumsy imitation of the Quran and started calling him Musaylima the liar, a nickname that stuck so well, most people remember it better than his actual name. After the Prophet died in 632, the rivalry exploded into war. Many tribes across Arabia believed their political and tax agreements to Medina died with the Prophet. They stopped paying taxes, and the unrest quickly turned into a massive armed rebellion as thousands joined Musaylima to challenge Medina's control. The first caliph, Abu Bakr, realized that the new state could collapse if he didn't move fast, so he launched a series of campaigns called the Ridda Wars and sent his most feared general, Khalid ibn al-Walid, to crush Musaylima's forces. The two sides crashed into each other at the Battle of Yamama in 633, and the fighting got so bloody it spilled into a walled orchard, later remembered as the Garden of Death. It only really ended after a thrown spear took Musaylima out, at which point his entire movement collapsed and the remaining tribes surrendered. Abu Bakr won, but the victory came at serious cost. Hundreds of the dead were Hufas, Muslims who had memorized the entire Quran by heart. At the time, the Quran wasn't yet a single-bound book. Much of it lived in oral memory and scattered fragments written on parchment, leather, and bone. Losing that many Hufas in one battle made the leaders in Medina realize a few more battles like this could erase parts of the holy book forever. So Abu Bakr ordered scribes to track down every verse they could find, both written and memorized. And that effort became the foundation for the first compiled Quran, Arab Conquest and Arabization. If you look at a modern map of the Middle East and North Africa, you'll notice something strange. Huge parts of the region speak Arabic, identify as Arab, and are grouped together as the Arab world. But before the 600s, that map looked very different. Egypt was full of Coptic-speaking Christians. Syria and Iraq had Aramaic and Syriac-speaking communities. Persia had its own empire, royal family, language, and Zoroastrianism as its main religion. North Africa was home to the Amazigh people. The Middle East wasn't one giant Arab civilization. That changed with the rise of Islam in Arabia. After the Prophet Muhammad died in 632, Arab-Muslim armies burst out of the Arabian Peninsula with remarkable speed. First came the Rashidun Caliphate, then the Umayyad Caliphate. They swept into Byzantine territory in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, then turned their attention toward the Sasanian Empire in Persia. Cities like Damascus, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Ctesiphon fell within a matter of decades. Part of the reason this happened so quickly is that the Byzantines and Sasanians had spent years beating each other senseless. By the time the Arab armies arrived, both empires looked like exhausted boxers trying to stay upright after 12 rounds. The first stage was conquest. Arab Muslim armies captured cities, ports, farmland, trade routes, and tax centers. The Byzantine Empire lost enormous territories, while the Sasanian Empire simply ceased to exist. But conquering a region and transforming it are two different things. After the wars, the caliphates increasingly used Arabic in government, administration, taxation, and public life. If you wanted a government job, wanted to deal with officials, or wanted to climb the social ladder, speaking Arabic suddenly became very useful. Over generations, that practical advantage helped turn Arabic into the dominant public language across huge parts of the Middle East. Places like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon had long histories tied to older languages and cultures. But under Arab Muslim rule, Arabic became the language of power. Languages like Coptic and Syriac gradually shrank, surviving mostly inside Christian communities and religious ceremonies. North Africa followed a similar path. During the 600s and 700s, Arab Muslim armies pushed west into Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. The Amazigh peoples responded in different ways. Some resisted, some converted to Islam, some joined Muslim armies and helped carry Islamic rule into Spain. Later, Amazigh Muslim dynasties would rule major parts of North Africa themselves. As the centuries passed, Islam spread across the region. Arabic became increasingly common, and later waves of Arab migration deepened the cultural shift. That's why countries like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya are now considered part of the Arab world, even though Amazigh identity is still very much alive today. Persia took a different route. Arab Muslim armies destroyed the Sasanian Empire and weakened the power of Zoroastrianism. Islam reshaped Persian society, and Arabic vocabulary poured into the Persian language, especially in religion, law, and scholarship. But Persia never became Arab. It adopted Islam while holding on to its language and cultural identity. Persia basically installed the new operating system, but refused to change the wallpaper. That was the long-term impact of Arab conquest and Arabization. Over centuries, it reshaped languages, religions, political systems, and identities across enormous parts of the Middle East and North Africa. Tier 3. The Qarmatians. Imagine you're a pilgrim visiting the holiest city in Islam. After months of traveling across the desert, you finally reach Mecca and join thousands of others gathered around the Kaaba, a stone structure at the center of Islam's most important mosque, the Masjid al-Haram. Then, without warning, the men standing beside you pull out hidden weapons and start attacking the crowd. That actually happened in January 930 CE, and the people responsible were a radical sect called the Qarmatians. The story begins in the late 800s, when the Abbasid Empire, a massive Islamic superpower based in Baghdad, was slowly coming apart at the seams. It had just spent years fighting the Zanj Rebellion, a huge slave revolt that wrecked its military and left the government badly weakened. While the empire was struggling to stay afloat, a charismatic preacher named Hamdan Karmat built an underground movement centered around the idea that a hidden savior would soon appear and overthrow the corrupt rulers. The Abbasids viewed the movement as a serious threat and started cracking down on it. Then things got worse. After a major ideological dispute with his superiors, Hamdan suddenly disappeared, leaving his followers confused, leaderless, and very much on the government's radar. With the empire hunting them and their founder gone, the movement needed somebody to keep it alive. They turned to Hamdan's top student, a former flower merchant named Abu Sa'id al-Janabi. He might not sound like revolutionary material, but he was excellent at organization and logistics. Abu Sa'id led his followers into the deserts of eastern Arabia, where he built a wealthy and surprisingly successful desert commune. The Qarmatians identified as Muslim, but they rejected major Islamic practices like formal prayer and fasting, and they helped fund their society by raiding neighboring settlements and attacking caravans. Things got even stranger after Abu Sa'id was assassinated, and his son, Abu Tahir al-Janabi, took over in 923 CE. About 5 years into his rule, Abu Tahir captured a young Persian prisoner named Abul Fadl, and somehow convinced himself that he was the Mahdi, the long-awaited divine savior. Abu Fadl was more than happy to play along, although his interest had nothing to do with Islam. He hated the religion and saw the whole Mahdi situation as a free pass to dismantle it from the inside. He gradually pushed Abu Tahir toward the idea that the pilgrimage to Mecca had no real value and should be destroyed. By 930, Abu Tahir marched his army right up to the gates of Mecca during the annual pilgrimage. He told the guards his men just wanted to join the prayers, so the city gates were opened right up. But once his men spread through the crowds, they pulled out hidden weapons and began attacking the unarmed pilgrims. They spent 8 days systematically ending pilgrims' lives and throwing the bodies into the sacred Zamzam well just to pollute the holy water. Then, to fulfill his goal of shifting religious power away from the empire, Abu Tahir ripped the sacred black stone right out of the central Kaaba building and carried it home. But just a few months after this massive heist, the entire plan completely blew up in Abu Tahir's face. He realized the Persian prisoner was a fraud who was secretly trying to revive an ancient pre-Islamic religion. Abu Tahir quickly executed the guy, but he stubbornly refused to return the stolen black stone. He placed the broken pieces of the rock in his own local mosque, hoping he could force the entire Muslim world to visit his city instead of Mecca. But nobody showed up. After holding the rock hostage for 22 years, the group finally gave up, sold the stone back to the empire, and went home. The isolated desert republic slowly ran out of money and vanished from history forever. The Assassins. Imagine yourself as a king sleeping inside a heavily guarded tent in the middle of a war zone. When you wake up the next morning, you notice your lamps are sitting in the wrong place. Then you look at your pillow. Someone has slipped past every single one of your guards just to leave a plate of hot scones and a poisoned dagger right by your head, along with a note telling you to pack up and leave or die. This allegedly happened to the famous Muslim general Saladin in 1176, while he was trying to conquer Syria. The people behind it belonged to a secretive religious group called the Order of Assassins. And just to clear it up, no, these aren't the hooded guys from Assassin's Creed who fight secret ancient organizations and jump off buildings into haystacks. The story starts back in 1090, when a Persian man named Hassan Sabah led a tiny minority branch of Shia Islam called the Nizari Ismailis. His group had a massive target on its back because the giant Seljuk Empire next door was strictly Sunni and viewed Hassan's followers as heretics that needed wiping out. Hassan himself was broke and had zero chance of raising an army to fight back, so instead of going to war, he literally weaponized fear. His first move was to find a base the Seljuks couldn't reach, so he set his sights on Alamut Castle, a massive fortress deep inside the Rocky Mountains of Persia. The castle technically answered to the Seljuks. Instead of launching a siege, Hassan quietly sent his followers in to take low-level jobs and slowly convert the guards over several months. By the time enough people inside were on his side, the original ruler woke up one day to find he didn't really control anything anymore. And Hassan simply walked in and took the castle without spilling a single drop of blood. With his mountain bases secure, Hassan began training elite agents called the Fidai. Their entire job was eliminating important political and religious figures in the most public and terrifying way possible. Fidai agents would spend years blending into a target city, posing as workers, guards, servants, or even religious students, just waiting for the right moment. Then usually, in the middle of a crowded public gathering, they'd pull out daggers and stab the target in front of hundreds of witnesses. After enough incidents like this, rulers across the Middle East became deeply paranoid. The assassins later expanded into Syria under a leader named Rashid ad-Din Sinan, operating out of Masyaf Castle. Under his rule, assassin agents allegedly infiltrated Saladin's camp, which led to the famous poison dagger story. Saladin quickly agreed to a truce afterward, because nearly getting stabbed in your sleep tends to speed up diplomacy. For almost 200 years, this constant threat kept the assassins safe, until 1253 arrived, and the Mongol Empire showed up. The Mongols didn't care much for fear tactics. Their army was so large that killing one commander just meant another took his place. And unlike previous enemies, they also brought siege weapons, capable of flattening mountain fortresses. Once your secret base starts getting hit with medieval artillery the size of a small car, the mystery tends to fade a bit. The surviving members realized they couldn't fight it, so they stopped the assassinations and melted back into the general population to survive. Salman Rushdie Fatwa. On August 12, 2022, at the Chautauqua Institution in New York, a 75-year-old author walked onto an outdoor stage to speak to a few hundred people. He sat down, and within seconds, a young man pushed through the crowd, climbed the stage, pulled out a knife, and started stabbing him in front of everyone. The author was Salman Rushdie, and the reason for the attack went all the way back 34 years to a novel called The Satanic Verses. The book is a complicated mix of magical realism, religion, dreams, and migration. Most readers struggled with it, but the controversy wasn't about difficulty. The problem was a section where Rushdie used a character clearly based on the Prophet Muhammad, gave him the insulting medieval name, Mahun, and wrote scenes that many Muslims saw as disrespectful to the Prophet, his wives, and the early history of Islam. In a faith where the Prophet is treated with the deepest possible respect, that was seen as blasphemy. The more attention the book gained, the worse the reaction got. Protesters in several countries burned copies of the novel in the streets, while religious leaders demanded it be banned entirely. Then, in February 1989, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, issued a fatwa publicly calling on Muslims around the world to kill Rushdie, along with anyone involved in publishing or distributing the book. Iranian religious organizations sweetened the deal by offering rewards worth millions of dollars. Just like that, a novelist suddenly became one of the most targeted writers in the world over a work of fiction. From that point on, Rushdie's normal life disappeared. British authorities placed him under heavy police protection, and for nearly a decade he lived in hiding, hopping between safe houses and using fake names. Going for a walk or meeting up with a friend had to be planned out, like a small spy operation. Except the spy was just a writer. Hiding Rushdie only solved half the problem though, since the people who'd helped publish, translate, and distribute the book were on the list too, and none of them had government protection. In 1991, the Italian translator, Ettore Capriolo, was stabbed inside his own apartment. Days later, the Japanese translator, Hitoshi Igarashi, was found stabbed to death outside his university office. In 1993, a furious crowd in Turkey surrounded a hotel where the Turkish translator, Aziz Nesin, was staying and set the entire building on fire. Nesin escaped, but 37 other people died in the blaze. Later that same year, the Norwegian publisher of the novel, William Nygaard, was shot multiple times outside his home in Oslo and barely survived. Over time, Rushdie slowly came back to public life. He gave interviews, attended library events, and eventually moved to New York. Iranian officials occasionally hinted they weren't actively chasing him anymore, although the original fatwa was never formally canceled, which meant that as far as plenty of extremists were concerned, the death sentence was still on the books. Which brings us back to that stage in 2022. The attacker turned out to be a 24-year-old man named Hadi Matar, who admired Iranian extremist ideology and reportedly believed he was finishing what the fatwa had started. While he was stabbing Rushdie, people in the audience and on stage rushed in, dragged him off, and pinned him down before he could finish the job. Rushdie survived, but barely. He lost sight in one eye, the use of one hand, and spent weeks recovering from stab wounds to his face, neck, chest, abdomen, and liver. In 2025, Matar stood trial in New York. The court found him guilty of attempted murder and assault, and the judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison. Masjid al-Haram seizure. Imagine standing in the marble courtyard of the Masjid al-Haram mosque in Mecca on November 20, 1979, the first day of a new Islamic century. You're among 50,000 worshippers waiting for the dawn prayer to begin. Then suddenly, armed men appear, shove the imam aside, grab the microphones, and start firing pistols into the air. Other members of the group sprint towards the gate and slam every one of them shut. Over the loudspeakers, the group's spokesman announces that the apocalypse has begun, and their leader is the Mahdi, the messianic figure in Islam who is supposed to appear before the end of the world. This was the start of the Siege of Mecca. The man leading the attack was Juhayman al-Otaibi, a former Saudi National Guard member who hated the Saudi royal family. Juhayman grew up idolizing the Ikhwan, a radical Bedouin militia that helped the Saudis conquer Arabia in the early 1900s. But after the kingdom was established, the royal family turned against them because the Ikhwan rejected modernization, Western alliances, and pretty much anything invented after camels. Juhayman inherited that same mindset, and he didn't shy away from speaking out about it. By the late 1970s, he had gathered a large following of hardline religious students. Over time, he became obsessed with Islamic end-times prophecy, and eventually came to believe that his brother-in-law, Muhammad al-Qahtani, was the Mahdi. To him and his followers, the name matched, the background matched, Even his behavior matched what the prophecies described. Once that belief set in, it didn't take long for the group to launch their revolution. Their first target was the Masjid al-Haram, the holiest site in Islam. At the time, the mosque was being renovated by the Bin Laden construction company, and Juhayman's followers used their links with workers to smuggle weapons and supplies inside using construction gear and even coffins. They kept building their plan piece by piece until November 20th, when they finally made their move. When the takeover began, the Saudi government froze. Violence inside the holy mosque is forbidden under Islamic law, so officials spent days arguing over whether soldiers were even allowed to respond. Inside, Juhayman's fighters turned thousands of trapped pilgrims into human shields, broadcast sermons throughout the mosque, and placed snipers in the minarets to fire down troops crossing the open courtyards below. Eventually, the Saudi religious scholars approved military force, and the government launched a massive assault using armored vehicles, commandos, and paratroopers. That should have been the end, but the rebels were prepared. They retreated underground into the Kabu, a giant maze of dark tunnels and basement chambers beneath the mosque. Saudi troops were not trained for clearing underground death mazes filled with fanatics, so they kept getting ambushed at close range while trying to navigate smoke, darkness, and endless corridors. The situation got so critical that Saudi Arabia secretly asked France for help. A small team of elite French commandos flew in to help plan the final assault. But since non-Muslims aren't allowed inside Mecca, they had to stay outside the city and run the operation from a remote command center. With French guidance, Saudi forces drilled holes through the mosque floors, pumped in tear gas, and threw grenades into the underground chambers. It worked, but it came at a cost. Many rebels were killed, along with hostages who had been trapped underground for days without proper food or water. After nearly 2 weeks of fighting, the remaining rebels ran out of ammunition, food, and air. By then, the supposed Mahdi had already been killed in the chaos, which, just in case you were wondering, is not how the prophecy goes. The survivors surrendered shortly after. Juhayman was later found hiding in the rubble, and in January 1980, Saudi Arabia publicly executed 63 of the rebels across multiple cities. Tier 4. The Tragedy of Bir Mauna. In the summer of 625, a group of 70 men arrived at a remote watering hole called Bir Mauna on the desert road between Mecca and Medina. They were the Qurra, or reciters, men who had memorized every verse of the Quran by heart. They figured they were safe, since one of the most powerful tribal chiefs in the region had personally guaranteed their protection. Then, as they rested by the well, the entire place was suddenly surrounded by armed tribesmen with every intention of killing them. To understand how this happened, you have to back up 4 months. The Muslim community in Medina had just gotten brutally ambushed by their biggest enemies, a powerful non-Muslim tribe in the city of Mecca at the Battle of Uhud. And Islam at this point was still small, still local, and definitely not the empire it would later become. The loss made every small neutral tribe in the desert decide the Muslims were weak and easy to push around. Around that time, a tribal chief named Abu Bara came to visit the Prophet Muhammad in Medina. Abu Bara didn't convert to Islam himself, but he suggested that if a few teachers got sent into the Najd region of Central Arabia, plenty of tribes there might accept the religion peacefully. Muhammad was skeptical at first, since the Najd tribe had a reputation for being hostile, but Abu Bara personally guaranteed the safety of any teachers under his tribal protection, and in Arabian tribal culture, that kind of promise was taken extremely seriously. Breaking one could start blood feuds that last longer than Grey's Anatomy. So Muhammad trusted the deal and sent 70 of his best scholars. When the group reached Bir Mauna, they sent one man ahead with a peaceful letter for a local leader, who happened to be Abu Bara's own nephew, a guy named Amir ibn Tufail. The problem was that Amir hated both Medina and his uncle's authority. He didn't even read the letter. Instead, he signaled one of his men, who walked up behind the messenger and stabbed him through the back with a spear. Then he tried to rally his own warriors to go finish off the remaining 69 teachers at the well, but his tribe flat out refused to break the older chief's sacred vow of protection. Since his own people wouldn't help him, Amir went shopping for backup elsewhere and got 3 radical extremist desert clans to join him. They surrounded the watering hole, ignored the teachers' screams that they were just peaceful scholars, and killed nearly all of them. Only 2 made it out. One was left for dead under a pile of corpses and managed to crawl away into the night. The other had been off grazing the camels during the attack, and once he realized what had happened, he ran all the way back to Medina to break the news. When the report finally reached the Prophet Muhammad, he was absolutely devastated, and his followers said they had never seen him in deeper grief. It also triggered an existential crisis for the early Muslims. Many of the Quran's living memorizers had just been wiped out in a single afternoon, which meant that their entire scripture was sitting one bad day away from being permanently lost. Bir Mauna was the first wake-up call. The decision to compile the Quran into a single written book didn't happen until years later, after the Battle of Yamama we talked about in the Musaylima entry. Yazidi Genocide. Imagine you're standing on a hot, dusty mountain in northern Iraq in August 2014. You're surrounded by thousands of families who've been running for days with no food or water. Below you, in the valley, men in black masks are going from house to house with lists of names, looking for a specific group of people they've decided shouldn't exist anymore. This was the start of the Yazidi Genocide, where the terrorist group known as ISIS used a religious excuse to turn an entire community into targets for murder and slavery. The people living in these mountains are the Yazidis, and they practiced Yazidism. They believed in one creator god who made the universe and then gave control of the world to 7 great angels. The most important of these angels is Taus Melek, also called the Peacock Angel, and this story was where the trouble started. God once tested the angels by creating Adam and commanding the angels to bow before him. While the other angels obeyed, the Peacock Angel refused. He argued that since he was made of pure divine light and Adam was made of dust, he should only ever bow to God. Because of this extreme loyalty to God alone, God was pleased and made him the ruler of the world. In the Quran, the central book of Islam, there's a similar story about a character named Iblis who also refused to bow to Adam. But in the Islamic version, Iblis was punished and became the devil for his pride. Because of this similarity, the militants of ISIS claimed the Yazidis were devil worshippers. They used this to label the Yazidis as mushrikun, which means people who worship things other than God. ISIS argued that because the Yazidis weren't Christians or Jews, who are usually protected under Islamic law as people of the book, they had no rights at all. When the ISIS trucks rolled into the region, the local security forces had already pulled out, leaving the Yazidis with no way to fight back. As the militants entered the villages, they gathered everyone together and separated them into groups. They put the men and older women on one side, and the younger women and children on the other. The men were given a choice: convert to Islam on the spot or be executed. Most refused. Because of that, the militants led over 5,000 of them to the edge of town, shot them, and buried them in mass graves. For the younger women, ISIS had a different system. They were cataloged, moved between cities, and sold in slave markets, with prices set based partly on age. In some cases, girls as young as 9 were sold for the price of a cheap smartphone. As bad as that sounds, there's more. In the Yazidi community, a child is only considered Yazidi if both their parents are Yazidi. ISIS believed that by forcing the women to have children with militants, the next generation would be born as Muslims instead of Yazidis. They also took the tribe's young boys and put them in cub camps, where they were brainwashed to become kamikaze bombers. Even though ISIS lost their territory in 2019, the damage is still there. Today, about 2,800 Yazidi women and children are still missing. Many survivors are still living in tents because their homes in the mountains are covered in landmines. On top of that, there's a law called the National Card Law that says if a child's father is unknown or a Muslim, that child must be registered as a Muslim. This makes it almost impossible for Yazidi mothers who escaped to bring their children back into their community. Religion has been used to justify some unhinged things across human history. And Islam, like Christianity, Hinduism, and every other major faith, has had its share of dark moments along the way. None of that defines the average believer just trying to live their life. It just shows what happens when faith gets twisted by the wrong people. If you made it this far, drop a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.